All right, Matthew chapter 6 in verse 5. We spent the last 2 weeks talking about Jesus and the matter of benevolence. And now we're looking at Jesus and the matter of prayer. And in verse 5, Jesus continues along the same line of thought with regard to our attitudes and our actions in the matter of prayer. He began in the section on benevolence, noting the hypocrites, which I believe are the scribes and the Pharisees, given how he described them in other places throughout the scriptures, particularly Matthew 23, and in other places in individual instances. And so I think he's still talking about the scribes and Pharisees in this text as well. And he says, and when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room and close your door. It says, and pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret shall reward you openly. And he says, and when you pray, do not use vain repetitions like the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask. And then he begins, but pray after this. When you pray, pray in this manner. And then he goes into what I said is commonly called the Lord's Prayer, but more accurately known as the model prayer, because it's given as a model for us. It's not given to us to memorize and repeat. It's just a form of prayer that Jesus provides for his disciples. And by the way, it's not all inclusive, because we can look at all the Bible has to say about prayer, and about 90% of it is not in this model prayer. The things that Paul talks about and that Jesus talks about elsewhere are not in this model prayer, but it's just set forth. It just set forth as a guideline, a pattern of sorts on prayer, and we'll look at the specifics. We'll look at the specifics of that later on. But I want to think about the opening lines here in verses 5 and 6, and then in verses 7 and 8. By the way, does anybody in verse 7 have another rendering besides heathen? I meant to look this up and I didn't do it. Does anybody have another rendering or have access to another translation that gives something other than heathen? Yes. Is that ESV? Okay, and that's where I was going with that, Scott, is
mine just has in brackets, it says
Gentiles. Okay, and so, and that's correct. That's correct. Again, this is being recorded by a Jew for Jews, and so he's talking about the opposite. He's talking about a different group of people. A different group of people from the Jews. And so, but let's focus on verses 5 and 6 just for a moment, and look at what it says and maybe what it does not say. But he says, he speaks about the Jews loving to stand in the synagogues and on the street corners praying, and again, so that they may be seen by men. Again, it's just like the benevolence case. They do these things to be seen by men. And Jesus affirms they have their reward. In other words, they got what they wanted. I cannot help but be reminded when I read this text of Jerusalem's Wailing Wall, where the Jews go down and they stand out there and they squall and they pray and they make a big show of the. Now this is and I forgot that it may be the Hasidics that do that. I should have looked that up. It's not necessarily the Orthodox Jews, but to speak of Jews in a general way is really not accurate, because there are different types of Jews. There are different groups of Jews within the Jewish system. The same way there are different Muslims. There's the Shiites and the Sunnis, and And there's different groups within that religion, and there's different groups within the Jewish religion. And those at the Wailing Wall do not represent, say, people like Ben Shapiro, who is an Orthodox Jew, and he's quite conservative in his thinking and his theology, but he's not one of those guys. All right. And so there are different groups, but I always think about the Wailing Wall when I read this text about people standing in the synagogues and on the street corners. And then he says in verse 6, says, "But when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." Now, let me just ask this question. Does this verse forbid us to pray in public? I don't think it does. I mean, my opinion is that it doesn't. I don't really know anybody who holds that position, although I know a brother, if he's still living, a brother in San Angelo. I'll tell you this story. When I was in San Angelo in 2013, I was in a meeting out there, and one of the local brothers was taking me and the preacher out to eat. It's Josh Romo, and he picked us up. We're in his car, and we pull in the parking lot, and he said, "I want to pray for our food in the car before we go in." And his thinking was he wanted to make sure that he didn't violate this verse by praying at the dinner table in the restaurant. And certainly, that's a man's prerogative, and I can at least respect, the meaning behind it. But I don't think it's necessary. Now, in his case, it was necessary because it would have been a violation of his conscience. If we said, "No, we want to pray at the supper table after our food gets here," well, that'd be a violation of his conscience, and also it'd be an unnecessary thing to do. Because we can pray for our food when we're sitting in the parking lot, or when the food gets there, or after we order, or any time. And so I don't think that this verse prohibits us from praying in public, and certainly it doesn't require us to pray at all times in our own closet. In other words, this text says, go into your room, and when you have shut the door, pray. Well, I don't think that's a blanket statement on how all of our prayers are supposed to take place. Again, remember, it's the contrast between what the Pharisees were doing and what Christians or disciples of Jesus ought to do. And so there's a contrast set forth here. And we can note in other areas where, like in Acts 20, when Paul was at Miletus and talking to the elders at Ephesus, then when he got ready to leave, they all went down to the beach, and they knelt and they prayed. And now, obviously, they were in public when they did that. And so, by looking at the practices of Christians in other settings, we know that Jesus is not forbidding public prayers. He's contrasting the attitudes and the actions of the Pharisees with the attitudes that Christians ought to have. Johnny.
Also, and I can't prove this. This is my thought on it. When he said, when you go into your room and shut the door, to reflect on your private time, your private prayer, to keep that up.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. That Jesus went out, and Jesus practiced this to some degree. He went up to the mountain to pray. He went up by himself to be alone to pray. And so Jesus practiced this, and that's certainly something that we ought to do is to keep an active private prayer life. I've told y'all this before, but I have a little reminder on my phone that comes up every hour of the day. And the little banner comes up and it says pray. Every hour of the day I get a little banner on my phone, and that's all it says, pray. And it reminds me every hour of the day that I'm awake that there's probably something that I need to spend just a little bit of time on. Maybe not even more than 10 seconds, 15 seconds, or a minute. In other words, there's something that I need to be thankful for, and it's really helped me. It's really helped me to be more thankful without the reminder. Billy and I were just talking about this a week or two ago about how we've become more mindful to be thankful to God over what might appear to be the smallest or the most trivial of things. For example, and I'm just using this as an example. Right? If you lost your wallet and you can't find your wallet, and then you find your wallet, be thankful, because you can be thankful because what is the alternative to not finding your wallet? How much time is involved? How much time would be involved if you lost your wallet, or ladies, your pocketbook? New driver's license. Call all the credit card companies, or call the bank for your debit card, or all your Social Security card might be in there. All the things that can fall apart just by losing your wallet. You find your wallet, you give thanks. You give thanks. And I've tried and I've learned to do that. And I'll give you a perfect example. Last night this happened. 20 minutes till 9 last night, I get a messenger phone call from a guy that I know who lives in Winfield. And he says, I just got some notifications on my game camera and there's some horses on it. And I said, uh-oh. See, I turned my horses loose in the lower pasture yesterday. And I went around to the east side and I closed that gate, and it never occurred to me that the new gate, the new double gate on the far southwest end of the pasture might be open. And guess what? Those two 12-footers were standing wide open. I mean wide open. And so I told Lance, I said, I'm guessing that gate's open. When they came through and picked the cotton and it's not closed, I said, what do you want me to do? And he told me about going down and going through this certain gate, but I left the house at about 9:15, and at 10 minutes after 9, I was sitting in my easy chair again, because my horses love me. So I'm walking down there, forgot to even take a flashlight. All I had was the flashlight on my phone. And I grabbed up a bucket that belonged to Tinsley, and I put my pocket knife in it so it'd make a noise when I rattled it. And so I'm walking down a dark road, and I open the gate, and I whistle about 3 times, and I always holler, come on, babies. That's what I say to them every time. Come on, babies. By the time I got the gate open and stepped through, it sounded like a thundering herd coming. They was piling in, and all I could see is 5 sets of eyes. 5 sets of eyes coming. I'm like, man, they are fixing to trample me underfoot. But they didn't. They came up, and I loved on them, and all I did is I just turned around, I shook that bucket with a pocket knife in it, and I started walking back down that dark road to where that gate was open. But them crazy things jumped over on the other side of the fence and raced through the field and beat me to the fence and ran into the field I was trying to get them in. And by the time I got there, they was all in the pasture, all 5 of them standing there, and all I had to do was close the gate. All I had to do was close the gate. Now, before I got off my property, I thank the Lord for that, because I could have been out there for 2 hours chasing horses and still not caught them, right? And that wouldn't have been any fun even with an extra hour of sleep. And so I think that's exactly what John's talking about here, is that we want to be more prayerful and mindful of even the smallest of things that go good for us in our lives, is to be mindful of God about all the blessings. So even those tiniest of things that we might not consider, is to be always, in everything give thanks. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17. In everything give thanks. Pray without ceasing. And so we can be, in other words, our prayers don't have to be long, they don't have to be wordy, they don't even have to be formal. They just need to be sincere. And they need to be consistent. And so I think that's what Jesus is talking about here in verses 5 and 6. Now, in regard to verses 7 and 8, and when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they will be heard for their many words. Therefore, do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask. I want to think about this text for a moment. Do not use vain repetitions. All right, what's the key word in that phrase there? Vain. The key word is vain. In other words, it's not wrong to pray for the same thing over and over again, right? I mean, sometimes, like when my mom had her stem cell replacement, how many times do you think I prayed for her, and I prayed for the same thing over and over and over and over and over again? Or when baby sister was about 3 months old and was in the hospital at Vanderbilt with RSV and in the NICU at Vanderbilt, and I'm in Kentucky in a tent meeting. I'm in the middle of preaching 6 days in a tent meeting, and I can't go. How often do you think I prayed for that baby over and over and over again? So the repetition's not the problem. The key word is vain. What does the word vain mean? Now look, I know how we use the word vain sometimes, but how does the Bible use the word vain? In other words, give me a synonym. A word association of sorts, if you can. Give me a synonym for the word vain. Useless. Good for nothing. Or for naught. Pointless. All right? And by the way, the word vain can be used in a serious way to mean empty. For example, if you came across somebody that was having a heart attack and you tried to perform CPR on them and you did everything you could, but they still died, you'd say all your efforts were in vain. In other words, they didn't accomplish what you wanted them to accomplish. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have done it, but in this case, the idea of vain is empty. It's empty. There's nothing to it. You remember, think about it in these terms. In Ecclesiastes chapters 1 and 2, Solomon talked about all the things that he had. I mean, man, you want to talk about a guy, look, just comparatively speaking, Bill Gates couldn't touch Solomon's wealth. Jeff Bezos couldn't touch Solomon's wealth. Elon Musk couldn't touch Solomon's wealth. If you put those three guys together, they couldn't touch Solomon's wealth. All right? And what did Solomon say of all the things that he had? He says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Empty. It's all emptiness and grasping at the wind. And so Jesus is here talking about vain repetitions, simply just rotely repeating a thing over and over and over and over again, not giving any thought to what you're saying. But just as long as you say it over and over and over again. Does that remind you of anything? Like today, is there anything that we might compare that to? In today's religious world? What, Johnny? Catholicism. How many Hail Marys can you say? How many Our Fathers can you say? By the way. Yeah. Now, I want you to think about something that you need to understand. The rosary is a collection of beads. All right? And there's a line of small beads followed by a large bead. I think it might be like 5 small beads and a large bead. 5 small beads and in other words, this pattern follows the entire rosary. Right? The point of that is so that you can keep count of how many times you say a prayer according to what the priest has told you to do. You go to confession and the priest says you got to go home and pray 10 Hail Marys and 5 Our Fathers. So what do? They get that rosary out, and every small bead is 1, and then they know when they get to the big bead, that's 5 or 10 or whatever, whatever the number is. You see how that works? And so, by the way, a boy that Shelby dated early on at Freed Hardman, his grandfather, Gordon Smith, was gospel preacher at Rainbow Drive in Gadsden. He was a Catholic convert. And he was preaching for us at East Wood Street in Paris, Tennessee, on why he left Catholicism. And even decades after he'd left Catholicism, man, he could rip off that Hail Mary faster than the guy reading the disclaimer at the end of the commercial on television. You know that guy, right? The guy who's reading, he's saying something so fast you really can't understand what he's saying. Gordon Smith could rip off that Hail Mary just that fast. He could rip off that Our Father just that fast. Decades later, why? Because he'd trained himself to say it just as fast as he could. Now, when I got out, he said, when I get out of the confessional and I got to go say my 10 Hail Marys, the faster I can say them, the faster I can get done and go do what I want to do. And by the way, I would just about be willing to bet that every single Catholic practices it in the same way.
They also, not even just those Hail Marys, every time they sit down to eat, they say the same. Everybody says it.
Oh yeah. Learned that on Blue Bloods, didn't we?
No, I didn't.
I did. I learned it on Blue Bloods. But yeah.
Sit there and I didn't know what to say.
Oh yeah. Rhonda grew up in St. Louis, and
They did mass.
yeah, and
I eventually kind of learned.
You learn it? Could you say it?
No.
Okay. But and so vain repetitions. In other words, we see this very thing going on in the religious world today, having been, and by the way, this is just one thing that Roman Catholicism has co-opted from the heathen world. This is not the only thing that the heathens have done that they've co-opted. How about turning the feast of the Saturnalia into Christmas? I mean, that's what December 25th was originally. It was a pagan festival, but they couldn't get their people to stop celebrating it, so they just tagged it as Jesus' birthday and let them keep going. And by the way, I'm not against the celebration of Christmas. Right? It's not my favorite holiday. I know it's a lot of people's favorite holiday. It actually starts on November 1st, the day after. What day did you put your tree up, Jill? Was it still October? Still October when the tree went up? Vince is nodding his head. Yeah. But yeah, I saw that all over Facebook the day after Halloween. Today is the first day of Christmas. Yeah. And then one of my friends in Dayton, Ohio, Ashley Melson's sister, was hollering about it snowing on November the 2nd. And she said, "What is this snow?" And I said, "Well, you did say it was Christmas Eve. On October 31st, you did say it was Christmas Eve."
Yeah,
She goes,
I saw a meme that said, for all of you that I blame all this cold weather on you people who insist on putting the Christmas trees up.
yeah, on November the 1st or earlier. But in any event, I'm not against celebrating Christmas. And by the way, even if you in your own personal celebration of Christmas, if you want to think about the birth of the Lord, that's perfectly fine. It's just a matter of personal preference. It's just not something that we're going to do. We're not going to do it as a church because that's not what the church is about. But I mean, there's all types of these things. You know, what about the pagans in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and the things about forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from food? You know, these are all things that were co-opted out of the world and just put into religious practice. And so, you know, this section here in Matthew 6 verses 7 and 8 is just one of a number of things that we might point to. Now, let me ask you this, because this happened to me when I was in school, and I think this is borderline. I think this is borderline a vain repetition. When I was playing basketball in high school, we'd be in the locker room before the game would start, and the coach would, you know, he'd give us the pregame talk and all that, and he'd walk out. And before we walked out, one of my really good friends and fellow basketball players insisted that we all say the Lord's Prayer before we went out on the court. Every game. Now, I'll just be honest with you. I had to learn it. I grew up in church. I didn't know it because that wasn't part of my upbringing to memorize the Lord's Prayer. You know, it just wasn't. You know, it wasn't that I was against it. But you know, the more I thought about it later on, I'm like, what good did it do for us to do that? In other words, was there some magical power in reciting the Lord's Prayer before the game that was going to confer some blessing of God on us? And I thought, you know, that might qualify as a vain repetition. In other words, just simply, you know, it's being said because it's in the Scriptures, and you say it, and you go out and you play basketball. And I think people today treat the prayer that we're about to look at here in a few moments in that way. But I love what verse 8 says with regard to our prayers. God knows what you need before you ask Him, right? Let me ask you this. Does He know what we need in spite of what we ask Him? You know, and to me, that's also a key. You know, God knows what we need. You know, let's just say I understand what I need or what I think I need. God already knows it. What if I think I need a thing and God knows that I don't need that thing? I'm also glad that He knows that, right? I mean, I've been thankful. To borrow the line from the old Garth Brooks song, I've been thankful for unanswered prayers. By the way, God answers all the prayers of His children. Sometimes He says yes, and sometimes He says no, and sometimes He says maybe, or sometimes He says my way, not yours, or wait a while. You know, but I've prayed for things. You know, I've prayed for things specific to the church that later on, when they didn't come to fruition, I look back and well, man, I'm glad I didn't get that one. I'm glad I didn't get that one. And so the Lord knows what we need, which is why we should pray all our prayers. What? That's right. Thy will be done. Thy will be done. And so that's you know if the Lord wills, as and in this prayer that we're looking at. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. All right, any thoughts on those 4 verses before we introduce the model prayer? All right, let's look at the text. In this manner, in other words, like this, therefore pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Now, the lesson breaks this prayer down into various ideas. And note it says, this prayer is a model in its direction. In other words, how did Jesus tell us to pray? I mean, it's just, who did Jesus tell us to pray to? That's right, the Father. Our Father who art in heaven. In other words, our prayers are to be directed to the Father, right? Not to Mary, not to any of the so-called patron saints. By the way, you may or may not know this, but St. Jude is the patron saint of lost causes. In Catholicism, he's the patron saint of lost cause. In other words, if you have a lost cause and you're a Catholic, you pray to St. Jude. All right? And so that, and by the way, Danny Thomas founded a hospital in Memphis. And by the way, it's a great hospital and it's a great charity. But that's the purpose for the name, the patron saint of lost causes. And so we pray to God. We don't pray to Mary. We don't pray to what's called the patron saints. And I'm of the mind that we don't pray to Jesus. Now, a lot of our brethren believe and practice praying to Jesus, but I just don't see it in the Scriptures. He didn't tell us to pray to Him. And that's the next point, Lex, is that if He's the mediator between God and man, then I'm not praying to Him, I'm praying through Him. I'm praying through Him. Now, some of the argumentation on this is, some of the defenses of praying to Jesus is that, well, Jesus is God and God is worthy to be worshiped and prayer is a form of worship, therefore you can pray to Jesus. But to me, that's a pretty tenuous argument because Jesus said, pray to the Father. Right? Jesus said, pray to the Father. And then some people say, well, we have references to people in the New Testament praying to Jesus. And while that is true, Stephen said, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. But what is the context of that? Was he just praying a regular old prayer? Or does the Bible tell us he looked up and he saw Jesus standing there? I mean, in other words, the context of that account is pretty important. Some people talk about some of the exchanges that, say, Paul had with Jesus. The thorn in the flesh, I besought the Lord 3 times that it would remove it from me. Or the times that Jesus and Paul had exchanges later in his ministry. And again, I just don't think that context exists for us today. Because when Paul said, I prayed to the Lord 3 times that He would remove it from me, Jesus talked to him. Didn't He? The Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for thee. When I'm weak, then am I strong. And so, again, I just don't think that context exists for us to pray to Jesus. And also, what did Jesus tell us to do? It seems, is that the first bell? All right, I'm going to need to stop. I need to stop there because I need to get the next set of lessons handed out. We will start right there, Lord willing, next Sunday morning. The prayer is a model in its direction.